Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session on climate justice, ensuring a fair, just and sustainable future for everyone. I'm joined today with Bradlie. My name is Bronwyn McLoughlin. As Raj mentioned, I'm a sustainability change and transformation specialist, climate change educator, and founder of People Planet Change. I'm coming to you today from Ireland. I hold volunteer roles in sustainability with PMI and GPM and the Change Management Institute. And while I have over a decade of experience in social sustainability, my interest in climate justice began when I trained with Al Gore's Climate Reality program. So now I'm going to pass you to my colleague, Bradlie, to introduce herself. She is one of my colleagues from Climate Reality. Over to you, Bradlie.
Hi, everyone. I'm calling in from Helsinki, Finland today. I've been with Climate Reality as a Climate Reality leader, mentor since 2018. I'm also the co-founder of the Climate Reality Europe Climate Justice and Community Empowerment Training. We've now trained almost 400 activists across Europe to take on climate solutions for their communities and to build them in a way that is ethical and fair. I have a background in environmental policy and law, and I currently coordinate the United Nations Environment Program, UEF course on multilateral environmental agreements, and I'm also locally active in Sustainability Community Finland. So very happy to have you with us today and would love to see in the chat where you are calling in from as well.
Great. So just a quick word on the Climate Reality project. Climate Reality was established by Vice President or former Vice President Al Gore. And the goal of the organisation is to recruit, train and mobilise people of all ages and backgrounds to work for climate justice solutions, with the specific focus around transitioning from dirty fossil fuels to clean renewable energy. So there's three areas that we focus on, which is around reducing emissions, financing a just transition and promoting international cooperation. And in that sense, we have 11 international branches around the world and a global network of over 3 million people who are focusing on this challenge. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at the website and feel free to sign up to the newsletter there as well. So in our session today, we're going to talk about what is climate justice, who's impacted, and how you can take action in your project capacity around climate justice. I think it's important for a great discussion today that we make space for all voices. So if you are popping something in the chat, please be respectful and willing to engage in what might be a slightly uncomfortable conversation for some of us. And that remember that climate work is complex work. There's no quick fixes here, right? So sometimes the solutions can look complex, but it's about being able to approach it with patience and curiosity and making sure that we're continuing to take steps forward. So let us know in the chat where you're coming from and what brings you to this session. I see we've got some folks already adding to the chat there, but please feel free to keep adding to the chat where you're coming from today and what brings you to the session. So first up, Bradlie and I wanted to share a little bit why we're bringing you this session today. And so for me, I think the first thing is that my observation is that sustainability and climate education is seriously lacking a climate justice focus. And I think we see that it is also largely absent from mainstream climate discussions in all locations. And given that my primary role is to work with organisations around sustainability and change, I also see that organisations are largely unaware of unintended consequences. So Bradlie, what is it that brought you to this work?
Yeah, so I've been working in climate spheres for a very long time. But shortly before the pandemic, there was a case of climate action really inadvertently impacting someone I care about deeply. My mom had an accident. She fell down the stairs, broke both her legs. And at the same time, the city that we live in southern Germany, was trying to build more bike paths and taking away a lot of places that were accessible by car or for wheelchair users because the buses aren't all equipped to handle the wheelchairs. So by having a climate action come in, my very outgoing, healthy mother who had always been running on walks everywhere, going all over the city, suddenly she had this temporary disability. But then the city's climate action was actually preventing her from going anywhere in a safe way or even accessing it all. And I think at that point, it became important for me to really not only talk about climate, but how in our own communities that climate action may inadvertently impact others without meaning to. So I don't know if there's an example in your city where you've seen that happen, where a positive climate city initiative might have had a negative consequence, but that is what we try and avoid when we talk about climate justice.
That's great, Bradlie. Thank you. It's like such a powerful reminder about why this work is important. So let's start talking about what is climate justice. But before we do that, we just want to recognize that climate change has both human and environmental impacts. And sometimes we don't always make that connection. And so what we see in terms of human impacts are things like famine, water scarcity, climate migration, impacts to public health, political instability, and threats to not only the global economy, but also our own personal cost of living. So between 3.3 and 3.6 billion people live in areas where they're highly vulnerable to climate change. And so it's important to really explore these elements around how climate can impact us personally, but also impact the others around us. So at this point, we're going to stop for a half a second just to get you to have a think about what do you think about when you hear the word climate justice? Pop it in the chat for us about what you think that means. And I'm going to wait until we get a couple of responses in the chat. So tell us what you think climate justice means. So Frank's telling us about drastically different national overshoots. What else do we have in the chat? Darius mentioned about cutting the water in municipally parks, preventing water waste. Yep, great. Pauline, hi Pauline, calling in from Canada, holding governments legally accountable. Thanks, Martz-Sigala. It means having respect for our future. Great. Thanks, Rita. Do not make our actions have a negative effect on others. Brilliant. So keep it coming, and we'll move on to the next slide. So in today's world, climate justice now is a rallying cry, often heard at climate marches as well as from politicians. But what does it actually mean? And the thing is, there is actually no single global definition of climate justice, but there's many good ones, some of which are actually in the chat that you've just added for us. So, but there's, I think, two things to remember. Good definitions of climate justice have two dimensions. And to quote our former Irish President, Mary Robinson, who was also a world-renowned climate justice leader, our definitions for climate justice should have interlinkages of human rights and the environment, and they should also include transformational, system-altering change. So we already know that inequalities exist in every society, but climate change exacerbates them all. So when we think about climate justice, we typically focus on three pillars. The first is around distributive justice, which ensures the harms and benefits of climate action are shared fairly. The second is around procedural justice. So that makes sure that everyone has a real voice in the decisions that affect them. And then finally, recognition justice. So we recognise that some groups face extra barriers because of history, inequality, or discrimination. So they may need different kinds of support to thrive. So why does climate injustice arise? Well, before we explore who is impacted by climate justice, it's important to understand why climate injustice and vulnerability exists in the first place. So climate vulnerability is not random. It's the result of deep, systemic injustices: historical, ongoing, and sometimes even unintended in the future. So historical injustices like colonization, land grabs, and resource extraction created wealth for some while leaving others exposed and impoverished. And I'm sure there's probably many people on this call that understand the implications of colonization on Indigenous populations. Current inequalities, such as poverty, racism, patriarchy, and health inequities, determine who can prepare for, respond to, and recover from climate impacts. So if we think about a flood event, we know that a wealthy person and a low-income person may experience this same flood in vastly different ways, and their ability to recover is very, very different. And then finally, some climate solutions risk creating harm if we do not protect workers, respect Indigenous rights, or ensure affordable access for all. And I think for me, this piece around thinking about the impact of the climate solutions we put into place was really the turning point in my thinking around why climate justice is important. We often think that just because we put in a climate solution, that solution is perfect and it's doing the job we intended it to be. But as Bradlie mentioned earlier, it often has unintended consequences and can sometimes also deepen existing inequalities. So in the next few slides, we'll explore who suffers the most, why, and what real climate justice demands. But just one concept I want to introduce here is a concept around intersectionality. And what we mean by intersectionality is that people's experiences are shaped by multiple identities. And so we need to understand that to be able to design fairer solutions that don't leave anyone behind. And in doing so, we need to understand how power impacts on these solutions. So some groups have more control, influence, and resources than others who have less protection. So this concept of intersectionality shows us how different parts of our identity shape our experiences. And this wheel gives you an idea of what intersectionality looks like and the circumstances and how the circumstances that we were born into or that even emerge through our life, such as the one that Bradlie highlighted earlier with her mother becoming disabled, and how those combination of different circumstances can dictate how privileged we are and the resources we have to cope with crises such as climate change. So the wheel helps us to take a moment to look at our own position. It isn't about guilt or blame. It's simply a way to understand how power works, who is heard, and who's more exposed. So try and place yourself on this wheel of privilege. Each colour in the outer circle represents a different identity category. So take a minute, think about how close or far away from the centre are you? How does your level of power shift as you place yourself in different identity categories? So when we look at all of those categories, towards the center of the circle, what we see there is what we traditionally expect. White, male, rich, people who have no care responsibilities, who are thin, are neurotypical. All of these people are considered to be have the most privilege. So where are you placing yourselves on that academic wheel of privilege? So given that you've had a minute or two to have a look at that, we're going to move on now, but I want you to keep this in mind as we go through the next section to look at who is actually impacted. So I'm going to hand over to Bradlie.
Thanks, Bron. So we're moving from what to who, or I should say maybe why to who, and who is most impacted by climate injustice. And of course, those least responsible are the ones that suffer the most. And climate justice is really about recognizing those vulnerabilities and then also leading solutions that are fair, inclusive, that involve the people in the solutions and in the decision making. So we've got a list of categories here, and we're going to go through them in the next slides in more detail. So our first category is the high risk and fewer resources, and that can be generally said as poor, disabled, and the aged communities. As Bron mentioned earlier about folks living in flood-prone areas, they have usually are living in more affordable areas, but of course, if a flood comes, they wash away, and their ability to recover is significantly less than someone with more money. People with disabilities, there's of course clear barriers to evacuation, maybe limited access to information. And in communities of older folks, they of course have higher health risks. Maybe they have, especially for heat waves, storms, or resource shortages, but they also might be lacking in mobility than they did when they were younger, and their ability to move is greatly compromised. Also very important is maybe they have lower digital skills. I think everyone has helped maybe someone older than them flip a PDF around to get to the right direction. But if all your emergency responses are coming through an app and someone doesn't have a phone, it doesn't help them. And likewise, when we're speaking to communities or running a survey just to find out what the community needs, if it's all done through a digital method and others don't have access to it or are struggling to access that technology, they're less likely to participate. Next slide, please. So our next category is then the vulnerability across generations and genders. Women and girls, of course, have higher gender-based violence. There's also cultural norms that might impact their ability to respond to climate impacts. For example, survival skills. We know when there's floods or tsunamis that women are more likely to be victims to drowning just because they might not have learned how to swim. Which is just one example. Children, youth, and future generations is very well represented in the media. Of course, the world that they're going to be inheriting and those impacts, but also that children are not small adults. They have smaller bodies that are growing and developing. And so when stress events happen or there's resource shortages, that can affect an individual's entire life trajectory. Yes, then we'll go on to the next slide. I think there might be some issues with the screen. No, it's okay. Yes. So the next is communities bearing historic and ongoing burdens. We know that racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to live in industrial neighborhoods or under-resourced neighborhoods. They might have less green space, more likely to be living next to landfills or to toxic waste sites. And overall, they're living closer to pollution and experiencing those negative health benefits. Also, these communities are sometimes inadvertently left out of bigger conversations. So if you have a town hall in the middle of the day, but you would like to have representation from a community where everyone is working multiple jobs, they're not going to be able to take off in the middle of the day just to come and be represented at a community level. So that's something also to keep in mind when you're organizing or trying to create solutions or a product or anything with a larger community overall. Next, of course, I'm calling in from Finland today, and so we do have an Indigenous population of the Sami people. Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land with deep spiritual and cultural ties, but they are also often displaced. There's land grabs, lack of consultation on climate, not only climate projects, but climate experiments. One thing to mention here, even in countries that don't have Indigenous peoples, there are also often communities that work very hard in preserving cultural background or cultural institutions and maybe locations, and they're working very hard to preserve that. And those sensitivities are also something to keep in mind when you are coordinating projects. The next slide, please. This one is also very interesting. Forced to move, fighting to survive. We have climate migrants in small island nations. This displacement is very sad. It's due to extreme weather events, whether it be droughts, floods, storms, sea level rise. But when people are forced to leave, it's usually they are stuck in a system of poverty and insecurity. We see this often with small island nations such as Tuvalu or the Maldives, where when sea level rise, once the salt water gets into the fresh groundwater, there is no more fresh groundwater and the island becomes uninhabitable for humans. This is also resulting in a loss of culture, loss of sovereignty and identity. But we also see in countries like the UK, where the smaller islands such as the Isle of Wight that are experiencing climate impacts now, and their accessibility and so forth is compromised. And we'll move to the next slide. This is also very important, which you'll hear a lot when you talk about climate justice, and that is a just transition. So we know that fossil fuel workers, those working in coal, oil, and gas industries, all over the world, it's about 11.5 million people. In the UK, it's between around 25,000 and 30,000 working directly in these fields. That we know we're trying to phase out these industries. Likewise, agricultural workers, over 25% of the global workforce, they're also vulnerable to changing farming practices, automation, and climate impacts. And what we try and talk about during a just transition is that we don't want anyone to be left behind. This means that folks working in these jobs, they need to be upskilling, reskilling, they need to have social protections, they need to be consulted fairly. And not only the workers directly, but in communities that have been built around an industry. We don't only have those working, for example, in coal mines, but we have teachers who are working at the school, folks working in the grocery stores, folks working in other markets. Those entire communities need to be consulted when we are changing, as we are going through this global green transition. So it is a very big and important topic, and most countries do have something about this in their National Climate Act. Last, but very much not least, is the Mormon human approach to climate justice. So, of course, we've been talking now about humans and those who are most impacted, but it is not only, of course, humans who are impacted by our entire truly global community. So we need to protect, in true climate justice, the plants and animals, our forests, rivers, lakes, and oceans, and mountains. They have been our partners in survival thousands of years ago. They are going to be our partners for survival in the future. We cannot forget about the rest of the world around us. So if you have, I think we can go to the next slide. If you just take a moment to consider who is impacted where you live and work, climate justice is always context specific of which communities need to be talked about. Every community has a different DNA, and who needs the most support in your community will always be different. So if you would like to drop in the chat, maybe a community that you know of that needs more support, do feel free to let us know. We're very happy to discuss this further. And as a reminder, here's a list again of not all of the communities who are impacted, but certainly many categories of people who are very impacted by climate change. And then I think it's back to you, Bron.
Great, thanks, Bradlie. I love listening to you speak about this because I constantly learn something new, even after 12 months of working with you. So thank you. All right, so how can I take action for climate justice? I know this is a very busy slide and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but on this page, what we recognise is that there's multiple ways in which collectively we can take action. We have individual actions to mitigate climate change on the left. So this is our circle of control. It's where we can choose to act today. In the middle, we have collective actions to support and educate and advocate for others facing climate justice issues. And this is our circle of influence. We can work with others to give climate justice a voice and influence decision makers. And we'll explore this a little further in the next section in our project capacity. On the right are the big system changes we need. This includes voting for those who will implement just policies and initiatives. It also includes ensuring finance is made available from governments, businesses, and other stakeholders to address historic responsibilities and support a just transition. And on the far right is our solution of last resort, which is taking legal action. So using the law to protect rights and put legal pressure on governments and polluters to act. Some of you may be familiar with this most recent case, which was the Swiss Grannies case. who felt, which was a group of grandmothers who felt the Swiss government was not doing enough on climate change and impacting their future human rights. So what we're going to explore next are those areas where you can focus on taking action in your project roles. So as project professionals, our stakeholder lists are often start and end with leadership, governance groups, clients and end users. And when we use a climate justice lens, it asks us to think far more broadly. So we need to think about who's impacted by climate outcomes, even if they're not in the room, and who carries the risk today and tomorrow. And so this is where we can use tools like the wheel of power and privilege to surface voices that we rarely account for. Projects must become more just and will become more just when we intentionally include people beyond the immediate organisation. So let's wrap up with 8 tips to integrate climate justice into our project work. The first is to recognise bias and privilege and use those tools like the wheel of power to spot missing perspectives and unintended impacts. We need to recognise that your project team probably isn't diverse. We do a great job in most organisations at an organisation-wide level, but at a project team, it gets less focus. So we need to bring in advocates who can help. So that would be including social impact or DEI leads in our governance forums. You could think about establishing an advisory insights panel or partnering with employee resource groups within your organisation. We should also think about the 80-20 principle. Most of the time, we designed for the 80%. But if we designed for the 20% who are most affected, that will enable us to meet the needs of the wider group. And we need to co-design with marginalised voices. So we need to use tools like inclusive ideation, listening sessions, community testing, storytelling methods, and participatory research to enable us to design with people and not for people. We want to map our supply chain. So we need to understand who's affected upstream in the projects, but also downstream, and redesign our procurement processes to reduce harm and increase fairness. So if someone's mining the resources, ships materials, disposes of waste, or feels the impact of transition, justice thinking asks us to surface those people, understand their realities, and shape procurement. A really good example here around supply chain is often our supply chain will include small organisations, and often they don't have the same level of resources that many of our larger organisations do. And so helping them to come on this journey around sustainability and climate justice is important. That might include having to upskill them because they're also affected by this transition. So as Bradlie mentioned earlier, we have people that are currently working in these industries. And so in every transformation, someone's going to pay the price, and whether that's peat workers here in the Midlands in Ireland, whether that's oil and gas workers, whether that is other individuals or contractors displaced by automation or frontline teams being reshaped by AI. So we need to think about how are we going to give them a pathway to develop skills for this new future. We need to also consider how to shift how decisions get made and what risks are being generated in the short and long term. Ask who benefits and who bears the risk. Think about including this in your risk log, business cases, and your benefits plans. And then finally, measure inclusion. So think about who spoke, who influenced, what changed. And if nothing's changed, then inclusion was just performative. So that brings us to the end of our kind of official presentation. But at this point, what I'd like to ask you to do is reflect on the question that Bradlie asked earlier, which is who's impacted in your location? What does your community need? Where's your personal circle of control and influence? And what could you do to work with communities and people that are marginalised? So just to wrap up, key concepts that we covered is that climate change is disproportionately impacting people and communities who are marginalised. Vulnerability is heightened due to a range of factors, including socio-economic status, race and geography, and that these can sometimes compound, and we call this concept intersectionality. Bradlie did a great job of articulating our most impacted groups around the globe. So poor, low-income communities, Indigenous people and communities of colour, women, children and elderly, and small island nations and rural areas who might be lacking for resources for adaptation. And then finally, we need to think about just solutions. So addressing root causes of climate injustice, implementing solutions that consider the unique needs of these affected groups, and ensuring participation and leadership that is genuine and involves people in decision making, and that our decision making is with those people and not for them. So here we are, bang on time, and open to questions. So at this point, I would like to hand it over to you, our audience, to ask any questions of Bradlie and myself.
Yep. Thank you so much, Bron and Bradlie, for an insightful and deeply meaningful section. I think we have one question from the audience. I'd like to highlight that one. So the question is from Avian. She asked that energy sector plays a major role in climate justice, so its accountability is crucial. In your view, what does true accountability look like for the energy sector when it comes to climate justice? Given that the energy sector is currently transitioning towards greener and bluer energy sources, how do we effectively encourage and support this transition period while still maintaining a strong accountability?
Great, thank you, Avian, for that question. Bradlie, did you want to take a crack at that to start?
Sure. So thank you so much for the question and for the difficulty in this question. So I mentioned earlier that climate justice is always very, very context specific. So accountability in one place might look different from accountability or justice even somewhere else. So if we're talking about, for example, in the Amazon rainforest where they've drilled for oil and there's been oil spills, how does that accountability look different than from a mining town in the UK? And because of its history, it's a little bit more difficult to say who should be accountable, particularly when areas have switched power so many times or have gone through different companies. Maybe the state has owned it. So that is not the easiest question. But looking forward quite generally of how we can support and encourage this transition. We can do it by supporting those communities, making sure that they have access to reskill, that the communities have access to relocating. And the main method as an individual, as in one of Bron's slides, is really by taking the individual actions that we can of voting, of informing, of using our voices to support our platforms, to support disadvantaged voices, but also of supporting local initiatives. So I know, for example, in the UK, there's several groups that have been working on the Rosebank, I think, oiled fields and about workers in those communities. So you can also support local groups who are trying to support the just transition and to pressure governments to do this in the most ethical way.
Great, thanks, Bradlie.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I think that's all the questions from the audience. And also we are right on time.
There's one more in the chat, I think.
Okay.
And is there International
Okay.
Court for Climate Injustice?
Yeah.
So there are climate change lawyers. I've dropped a report in the chat earlier. I can drop it again from the Climate Litigation Network. Usually this is done at the national level. At the international level, we actually, this summer, the International Court of Justice released their advisory opinion. This also had a big impact at COP30 in Belém, which was just a few weeks ago. So it's the ICJ advisory opinion. And this has been influencing other courts around the world. But I would really recommend looking into the resources at the climatelitigationnetwork.org. And I'll add one more one more link later.
And I just might jump in on that before we pick that off. Client Earth is an amazing organization worth following. They do a lot of work in this space. You'll find them on LinkedIn talking quite regularly about the work that they're doing to support this area. All right. So I think we've got 2 minutes to the end of our session. So Raj, I think we'll hand it back to you at this point to wrap us up.
Okay, thanks, Bron, and thanks, Bradlie.